Blood dripped from Talia's forehead, but Blake burst out laughing. Just standing here is reason enough to get kicked. The entire corner went silent. The only sound left was his shoes grinding against the sidewalk, a reminder of who held the power. Hart gripped her arm tightly, his voice slick with malice. Don't pretend to be clean-skinned like that is never innocent. Talia lifted her head, eyes blazing. You've just made yourselves living proof of a rotten justice. The crowd shuddered a sharp nod, a phone raised, and the tragedy became kindling. That morning, harsh sunlight poured onto the quiet commercial corner just as stores were opening. Discount signs had just been hung, still carrying the scent of fresh paint. A few shops were beginning to open, the sounds of tapping on glass and scraping of plastic chairs mingled with the sticky heat of early day. Talia Brooks stopped in front of a sporting goods store, her eyes on a newly posted promotion sign outside, one hand adjusting the strap of her backpack. She wasn't in a hurry. She simply stood there, reading each line like any regular shopper. Only the glaring sun made her squint, unaware that just seconds later that stillness would shatter like a mirror crashing onto the concrete. Footsteps pounded on the sidewalk, firm and deliberately loud. Two shadows in police uniforms stretched long in the light. One, tall and broad-shouldered like a wall, eyes seething with suspicion as if scanning every inch of exposed skin. The other standing slightly behind, hesitant but falling in step. Sergeant Blake walked straight over his twisted grin, pulling one side of his sun-darkened face as if he saw not a woman reading a sign but a criminal in plain sight. He squinted, scanning from head to toe, from the bead of sweat on Talia's neck to her dusty running shoes, then spat out a line that instantly turned the air bitter. Gym clothes and loitering here. Not afraid someone might think you're a thief. His voice was dry, paired with a smirk like a joke he found too entertaining, soaked in insult. A few passers-by glanced over an old man with a cart, quickened his pace, wanting no part of it, while a young woman inside the shop rushed to draw the blinds. The air around Talia thickened, but she didn't let the contempt tear through her calm. She took a deep breath, about to speak, but before a word left her mouth, Blake's Solonaden boot came flying. The kick landed like a hammer straight to her stomach, folding her over breath, stolen her forehead, slamming into the metal signboard with a blunt crack that jolted the entire street. A streak of red slid down her cheek, mixing with sweat, the sunlight making it gleam like fire. A man on a bike across the street shook his head, eyes wide but too afraid to intervene. The store door remained wide open, but no one came out. Only Talia's gasping breath and Blake's satisfied grin echoed in the terrifying stillness. Blake stood tall, breathing evenly like he had just completed a routine move. He straightened his uniform shirt and looked down at the woman, still catching her breath on her knees. See, a cop's instinct is never wrong, he said, voice flat, deliberately dragging the final word to provoke. Officer Hart stood behind, fist still hovering, eyes flickering with doubt. But eventually, he stepped forward, placing a rough hand on Talia's shoulder as if to keep her from rising. The oppression didn't just come from the kick. It came from the eyes, the breath, every ounce of contempt pouring down on her. Talia stayed, bent over, wiping the blood trailing near her mouth. A crowd had started to gather. No one stepped in, but the murmurs spread. A man's voice whispered, "That's too much." She was just looking at a price sign. A woman hurried her son away, afraid he might ask questions. The air grew heavy, as if the whole street was watching a play with a pre-written ending, where those in power got to play the villain, and the audience was forced into silence. Blake stepped closer, his shadow falling over Talia's face, his eyes radiating challenge. He tilted his head, voice laced with venom. Around here, black folks don't get to stand and read ads. You buy quickly or you leave. Stand too long and you're guilty. His words hit like acid, poured onto an open wound, making even bystanders feel shamed. Hart, the partner, stayed silent, but his grip tightened, forcing Talia's face against the cold glass of the store window. Blood dripped onto the gray tiles, each drop ticking off the tension rising. A young man sitting at the cafe across the street quietly raised his phone camera, aimed heart pounding as he realized realized this moment would explode if seen by the world. Meanwhile, Talia slowly raised her head, a fiery spark in her eyes. Her voice was hoarse but firm. "You kick at me because of my skin color, and you think you'll get away with it?" The question sliced through Blake's laughter like a blade, making him pause before snarling back, "I kicked because of a cop's instinct, and that instinct said you needed to be checked." The confrontation on the sidewalk was no longer between one woman and two officers. It had become a mirror reflecting the entire block. Glances stolen, coughs covered, hesitant footsteps frozen mid-stride all formed an invisible ring around the three figures. The quiet was shattered as the store's doorbell chimed, but no one dared to go in and shop. An old man muttered, "Is this really America?" before shaking his head and walking away. In that moment, Talia knew she had become the center of attention, not by choice, but by force and prejudice. Yet, her gaze held no fear. The next words she spoke landed like stones thrown into a strained pond. "Today won't pass the way you think it will." And right then, the phone across the street kept rolling, capturing not just violence, but the fire rising in the eyes of a woman who had bled but refused to kneel. The whole street seemed to hold its breath with only the wind swirling distant traffic humming and the sharp smell of asphalt baking under the sun. Blake curled his lips into another smirk, but for a fleeting second it faltered. He didn't know that his kick had left more than a cut on her forehead. It had just triggered the storm he and his partner would have to face. By now, the crowd had grown larger. It was no longer just a few furtive glances from afar. The harsh morning sun cast long shadows across the gray tiles, and the trail of Talia's blood on the promotional sign made the air feel heavier. Those standing nearby pretended to check their watches or covered their mouths to whisper, but everyone knew this was no longer just about a woman and two officers. It had become a public display in the middle of the street. Hart, who had kept his distance until now, finally stepped in. His thick, calloused hand clamped around Talia's wrist, twisting it back and slamming her into the glass door of the store. A fragile, cracking sound echoed as her shirt pressed hard against the glass, which vibrated under the force. He held it tight, eyes turned away as if unwilling to face her, but his grip was unrelenting, like proven loyalty to the one clearly in charge, Blake. Talia turned her head, blood still trickling from her forehead, breath sharp and heavy, but her gaze didn't drop. She saw her reflection in the glass, the red streak down her face, like a mark of truth that couldn't be erased. Around her, soft murmurs began to rise. A middle-aged woman whispered, "What are they doing in broad daylight?" but then pulled her purse up to cover half her face. Blake walked forward slowly, each step landing hard on the sidewalk like a steady beat pounding in the minds of those watching. He stopped beside her, leaned close to her ear, and spoke with scorn soaked in venom. "Strangers in this area with skin like that aren't usually here to shop. You think anyone's gonna believe you were just reading a discount sign?" His words sliced into the thin skin of patience, each one seeping into the air, drawing awkward stares from the crowd. An old man grimaced, hands tightening around the handle of his cart, but all he could do was shake his head. A younger man turned to his friend, voice trembling. "If it were me, I'd have fought back already." But even he didn't dare step forward. The way Blake stood there, arrogant and pleased, was like a beast used to the scent of blood, confident no one would ever dare touch him. Hart still gripped Talia's wrist. His palm was damp with sweat, but the pressure didn't let up. She drew a deep breath, her body trembling yet. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady enough to send chills through a few of the onlookers. "Did you kick me because of my skin color?" Every word was sharp, unwavering, loud enough for those nearby to hear. The question wasn't only aimed at Blake, it challenged the entire space, suffocating in silence and cowardice. It struck like a spark thrown into gasoline, making the already thick atmosphere seem to detonate inside the minds of those who watched. Blake paused for a second, lips pressed tight, before he let out a scornful snort. He tilted his head, straightened up, hands on his hips, voice raised loud enough for the entire crowd to hear. "Kicked because of a cop's instinct, and that that instinct doesn't lie. Instinct says you're not clean. That's the reason. The answer was blatant evasion, yet spoken with smugness, as if he had just unmasked a real criminal. A ripple of murmurs spread through the onlookers. Some shook their heads. Others took sharp breaths as if about to yell, but held back. Blood ran down Talia's chin, mixing with sweat, but her eyes stayed sharp. She tilted her head and looked straight at the man towering over her, a gaze that made Blake visibly uneasy. Her voice dropped cold and cutting. Instinct or prejudice. You call this humiliation a form of law enforcement. The crowd fell silent. Her words landed like a slap across the arrogance Blake had been wearing. Hart, still gripping her wrist, couldn't bring himself to lift his eyes to meet hers. The tension on the street peaked every second, ticking by like a suffocating beat. Blake scanned the crowd, spotting several phones raised discreetly, camera lights glinting in people's eyes. He frowned, but instead of backing down, he doubled down, voice tightening. Don't think shouting makes you believable. Around here, a cop's word weighs more than your blood. The statement struck like a hammer, but also exposed his truth so clearly that it needed no interpretation. Those filming knew they had just captured a moment that could shake the entire city. Hart's hand, still clamped around Talia's wrist, began to tremble slightly. He could feel the pulse under her skin, feel the strange calm in her unwavering stare. A flicker of hesitation flashed in his mind, but he crushed it quickly, tightening his grip as if to erase any sign of doubt. Talia closed her eyes for a second, took a deep breath, then opened them again. Her voice remained steady and firm. You can press me against the glass, throw cheap words, but the truth doesn't live in your hands. It'll find its way out. That line echoed sharp enough to make even the quiet ones glance at each other. A woman in the crowd clutched her daughter's hand tighter, bent down, and whispered something, but the girl still asked clearly, "Why did that man kick her?" The question pierced through the fake armor Blake had been wearing, making a few people shift uneasily. Blake's eyes flared with anger. He spun around and barked. "What do kids know, then?" Inhaled sharply, as if trying to swallow a rising rage. Behind them, the murmurs spread, and phones were no longer hidden. They were now raised openly. Blake noticed, but it was already too late. With his own cruel words, he had turned this moment into a public confession under the harsh glare of morning sunlight in front of people who at first only meant to pass by, but were now forced to witness a truth too stark to deny. The scene ended in an unbalanced confrontation, yet strangely, no one saw Talia as defeated. Blood on her forehead, wrists twisted in pain, her body pinned to the glass, but it was her calm voice and steady gaze that commanded the street. In that moment, she was no longer just a victim. She had become a mirror, reflecting the raw truth that Blake and Hart had laid bare through their own actions. The air outside the sporting goods store was now suffocating. Instead of hurrying past, people had stopped forming a silent half-circle like spectators forced to watch a play they hadn't bought tickets for. The harsh sunlight reflected off the glass door, where Talia's pinned shadow was still visible, streaked with smeared blood, forming unsettling shapes. Blake stood right in front of her, a sneer glued to his face, and yanked the strap of her backpack without warning. The zipper tore through the silence with a sharp screech, the sound of bare violation. He didn't ask, didn't need permission, just pulled her belongings into the open, treating her privacy like a trash bag dumped out on the curb. A sweat-drenched towel came out first. Blake held it up, turned it over, then tossed it to the ground with a voice with mockery. This what you packed to run faster after stealing?" The crowd stirred. A few people winced. Some looked away, unable to watch the absurdity unfold. Next came a clear plastic sports drink bottle, glinting in the sun. He shook it, popped the cap, sniffed it, then chuckled. "Water or something hidden inside. You think a cop's gonna fall for this kind of childish trick?" He slammed it down on the pavement, splashing liquid that spread into cold, wet patches. Talia stood still, her wrist still clamped by Hart, but her eyes didn't flinch. She watched every item pulled out, every sneer thrown her way, and suddenly her voice rang out, dry metallic like steel striking stone. "Everything you say will find its way back to you." The words cut back cleanly. No shouting, no drama, but sharp enough to make heads turn. A young man in the crowd mouthed the line, then nodded slowly as if he had just witnessed an arrow strike the heart of arrogance. Blake froze for half a second, his eyes flashing surprise, but then he burst out laughing, the sound cracking through the broken air. Hear that? She thinks she's profound or something. Out here, words won't pull you out of my hands. He bent down again, pulling a pair of gym gloves from the bag, holding them up for the crowd, turning them like trophies. Oh, gloves. Great for breaking into doors, not just for workouts. The crowd murmured. Some let out awkward chuckles, but more eyes were now fixed on him, filled with disgust. At a nearby cafe table, a young man who had been seated from the start reached for his phone with shaking but determined hands. He hit record. The frame trembled at first, then steadied, capturing Blake as she tore through Talia's backpack, her belongings scattered across the sidewalk. The man leaned forward, pretending to sip his coffee, but kept the phone locked in place. Inside, he knew what he was holding wasn't just evidence of violence, it was humiliation exposed in broad daylight. Blake continued pulling out a small notebook, flipping through a few pages, his eyes skimming the pencil-scrawled lines before sneering a theft plan or a list of Target stores. He gave a dry laugh, snapped the notebook shut and slapped it against his palm as if he had uncovered solid evidence. Hart remained silent, his eyes turned elsewhere, but the grip on Talia's wrist seemed to tighten as though to mask his own discomfort. Amid the chaos, Talia slowly lifted her head. Though her back was still pressed hard against the glass, her voice held steady, each word clear. You can throw my things on the ground, but you can't throw away the truth. The truth will be in the eyes of everyone here. Her words rippled through the crowd, out again. Those standing close glanced at one another, then down at their shoes as if trying to avoid being pulled in, but deep in their eyes, quiet anger was building. Blake laughed again, but the sound had lost its force. In that moment, he seemed to sense an invisible current spreading from the bleeding girl who refused to bow. You think these people watching will take your side? They're scared they'll stay quiet, and when they stay quiet, I win. He spat each word, but his voice fell hollow in a crowd that was growing increasingly uneasy. The wind swept through the corner, carrying the acrid scent of hot asphalt mixed with the sharpness of blood. Talia's belongings lay scattered across the pavement, silent proof of a violation without cause. Across the street, the phone at the cafe table continued recording every drop of blood, every twisted smile, every cut and remark. The young man holding it could feel his pulse sinking with the footage, knowing this video would eventually ignite a fire strong enough to burn away the polished mask of authority the two officers were wearing. In the blazing sunlight, everything Blake had just done no longer looked like control. It had turned into a public display of abuse. And at the very moment he believed he held the upper hand, the raised phones from all corners had already made him the one, confessing, exposing it all under the searing light of that morning. Late afternoon spilled over the street corner, sunlight slicing between tall buildings, gilding the walls and stretching the shadows of silent figures. The air felt heavier with heat still radiating from the morning. On the sidewalk, Talia's blood had dried into a dark stain like ink pressed onto wrinkled paper. The gash on her forehead throbbed with each heartbeat, but it didn't blur her vision. On the contrary, her eyes had sharpened like a quiet fire, still burning when pushed to its edge. In front of her, Blake stood with the posture of someone certain he had broken his opponent, a smug grin playing on his lips. "Now, do you know your place?" he growled, leaning in as if making sure his words pierced deep into the mind of the woman standing before him. His voice cut through the growing roar of evening traffic, drawing a cruel contrast. Out there, people rushed home from work, while here, a woman who had just been beaten was forced to swallow another insult. Talia tilted her head slightly, hair matted with sweat and blood clinging to her temple, but her gaze held firm. She stared directly at Blake, not with flaring hatred, but with a calm so solid it seemed to still the air around them. Her voice lowered just loud enough for both him and the onlookers to hear. "This day will come back to you." Each word landed like a slow chisel into the mask of authority Blake wore. For a moment, Blake froze. His eyes flicked in surprise, the muscles in his face tightening as if someone had slapped him. A single second, but it stretched in his mind like a shadow tearing across the light. In her eyes, there was no fear, no pleading, only certainty, a warning of something he would never be able to control. And in that instant, his arrogance began to shake. But the instinct of someone long protected by power quickly rose back up. Blake let out a dry laugh, trying to snap the tension back under his grip. He stepped back, glancing down at the dried blood on Talia's cheek, as if to remind her of the humiliation she'd just endured. Threatening a cop, "You'll soon learn that words like that only make things worse." He said it, but the conviction in his voice had faltered, his tone edged with a trace of strain. Hart stood beside him, still holding Talia's wrist, though the grip had loosened. His eyes avoided hers now, as if he no longer wanted to be part of the prolonged theater of disgrace. Perhaps he had sensed something in her words, a threat Blake had missed, and around them the crowd's expression had begun to shift. No longer just fearful or curious, their eyes now held something else, as if they had just heard a prophecy. Blake signaled to Hart, and both released their grip and turned away. They walked off the sidewalk as if nothing that had just happened mattered, as if it wasn't worth remembering. But each of their footsteps echoed like drum beats through the heavy silence that lingered behind. No one in the crowd said a word. They simply watched a few phones still recording until the two figures disappeared from sight. Talia stayed there, her back against the cold glass shoulders, trembling slightly but her gaze steady. She raised a hand to touch the wound on her forehead. The blood had dried into a thin crust, stinging, but also marking what had just taken place. Passers-by lowered their heads as they walked past. No one dared speak, but in their eyes the image of the woman standing tall, even as blood traced her cheek, had already taken root. A little girl tugged her mother's hand wide-eyed and softly asked, "Why did they do that to her?" The mother didn't respond, only held her daughter's hand tighter and walked faster. But the question had already been planted in the air like a seed of doubt. And those seeds would grow not today, then tomorrow, not here, then on other streets when truth could no longer be buried beneath any surface. Talia sighed and picked up her backpack from the ground. Her scattered belongings lay across the pavement, some dirtied, some broken from Blake's rough handling. She didn't hurry to gather everything, leaving a few small items behind, as if to show they no longer mattered. What mattered more were the eyes that had seen and the videos that had been recorded. She knew this moment wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The late afternoon sky turned gold, car horns echoed in steady rhythm down the block into the corner where a woman with dried blood on her forehead had just left behind a warning. "This day will come back to you." The words, small as they were, carried more weight than any kick or grip ever could, and in the eyes of those who witnessed it, they were etched like a mark that could never be erased. Blake and Hart had left, but the weight of what had happened remained like smoke still hanging after a fire had passed. They believed it was over. Turning away had ended everything. But they didn't know those phones had already begun uploading what they had done, that Talia's words had sparked a flame none of them would be able to contain. The evening wind swept through, carrying with it the quiet murmurs of the street, but in Talia's mind every word, every gesture from Blake was burned in like a scar that would never fade. She knew that no matter what today would return, not as a painful memory, but as an indictment of those who thought themselves untouchable, would eventually have to face. The evening closed in, leaving behind long slanted shadows and a smear of dried blood that hadn't been washed away. But from that blood, from those words, a new series of events had begun, threading through every glance, every tap of a phone screen, every whisper that could no longer be silenced. And that would be what brought this day back, heavy, fierce, and impossible to avoid. Night had fallen over the city, with only a few scattered headlights from motorbikes and cars rushing home. The air was thick and stifling after a day scorched by the sun, but inside Talia's small apartment it felt entirely different. The place sat on the third floor of an old building, the walls worn, the narrow window offering just a sliver of sky. The only light came from a yellow bulb in the bathroom, casting a glow on faded white tiles. There, Talia stood before the mirror holding a cotton pad soaked in saline, slowly wiping the dried blood from her forehead. The cold water stung her skin, and the red flakes fell into the sink, bleeding into pale brown stains. Her hand trembled not just from the pain, but from the shock of the morning that had yet to leave her. The mirror reflected a woman with tangled hair, a face slick with sweat, and dark circles under weary eyes. But if one looked closely, they would see those eyes hadn't shattered. They bled, they hurt, but beneath them was a flicker of fire, a quiet defiance forged from humiliation. Talia bit her lip, closing her eyes as the cotton touched the cut. The pain shot through her skull and made her groan softly, but she opened her eyes again and stared into the mirror. In that reflection, Blake's face appeared clearly. His crooked grin and bitter voice echoed, "Now, do you know your place?" The line repeated in her head like a hammer striking a wall, loud and relentless. She set the cotton aside, both hands braced on the sink, taking a deep breath to steady herself. For a moment, her legs threatened to give way, and the thought, maybe let it go, drifted by like a shadow. But then, the strong vibration of her phone from the living room cut through everything. It wasn't loud, but in the still apartment it sounded like a bell snapping her awake. Talia quickly wiped the wound, wrapped it in a thin bandage, and stepped out. On the old wooden table, her phone screen glowed with a message from a close friend. "You need to see this." Attached was a video file. Talia tapped it open, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. The screen filled with a scene she knew too well, the street corner that morning, the harsh sunlight, and then Blake rushing in his legs, swinging full force into her stomach. The sickening thud rang out, and in the footage, Talia folded in half, her forehead slamming into the metal sign, blood sliding down her cheek. The camera shook slightly, but it captured everything clearly. She stared at the screen, eyes fixed, not blinking once. After the kick came Blake's voice, thick with contempt. "Strangers in this area with skin like that aren't usually here to shop." Then came her own voice, hoarse but strong. "Did you kick me because of my skin color?" Followed by his scoff, "I kicked because of a cop's instinct." The clip ended in the hum of background murmurs, a few shaky frames, then went black. Talia dropped into the chair, eyes wide, her hand gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. A wave of emotion crashed over her, anger, humiliation, pain. She felt torn open all over again, not by a kick this time, but by the raw truth replaying before her eyes. But the more she watched, the more she realized the clip wasn't just a wound, it was a weapon. Every frame was evidence, every word was fuel, every glance from the crowd was a witness. The video didn't just capture the abuse, it captured her courage, standing in blood, daring to ask her attacker about race. She played the clip again, but this time her eyes had changed. When the kick landed, her lips pressed tight. When the blood ran, her eyes lit up. When the phrase "a cop's instinct" echoed, she smirked a dry, bitter smile. The clip ended, and this time Talia didn't sit trembling. She leaned back in the chair, her gaze slowly turning to steel. The phone buzzed again, another message from her friend. "If you want, I'll send you the original unedited. Whatever you're going to do, decide fast." Talia stared at the words, her mind spinning with choices. She could stay silent, file the video away in a drawer, let it sink into the darkness like thousands of other buried stories. She could send it to a lawyer, a journalist, or a human rights group. Every option carried risk, came with a cost. But somewhere inside she knew this moment was the turning point, and there was no backing down. Outside the window, car horns drifted in, and the murmur of passing voices filled the air. Talia tightened her grip on the phone, closed her eyes briefly, then opened them and dialed. As soon as the other line picked up, her voice came through short and firm, without a hint of hesitation. "Send me the original. It goes out tonight." The words cut through the silence like a blade leaving behind a finality that couldn't be undone. She set the phone on the table and leaned back in the chair, eyes lifting to the ceiling. Her heart was pounding, but strangely, there was calm in her chest. The decision had been made, and there was no turning it around. The room dimmed as night settled in, with only the yellow glow of a desk lamp casting light across her steady face. Talia stood up and stepped out onto the narrow balcony where she could look down on the street below. The headlights stretched into long streaks, and the people passing by moved like shadow. She pressed a hand to her forehead, feeling the sting of the wound, but inside her, fire had already been lit. "You started this," she whispered, her voice nearly lost in the wind. "I'll finish it." The city outside remained loud, but in that small apartment a decision had taken form, one that couldn't be reversed. The blood on Talia's forehead was no longer just a wound. It had become a marker, a red seal on the indictment that those in power would soon have to face. And tonight, with the click that would send the video out, the city would know exactly what had happened in broad daylight. The next morning, as sunlight crept through the hole, cut through the dusty windows of the city, local social media erupted like a fire set to dry tinder. An anonymous account, which had only a few hundred followers before, posted the full video capturing Blake's kick to Talia's stomach along with his venomous insults. The caption above was brief, just 4 words: instinct or prejudice, but it was enough to ignite a firestorm of debate. That short question sliced through the thin veil of Blake's excuses, forcing anyone who scrolled past to stop and watch until the end. Within an hour, views had already surged into the thousands. Shares spread with stunning speed like oil seeping into every corner, from local residents to accounts across state lines. People passed the video along, accompanied by a flood of outraged commentary. The number of shares climbed from 1,000 to 10,000, then 20, and by mid-morning it had passed 50,000 and still rising. The captions added with each new post were no longer isolated voices of outrage, but a collective roar from a community that had been insulted. Beneath each share, the comments piled up thick and fast. "He kicked her like a punching bag," disgusting one person wrote with a blazing red anger emoji. "If that were my mother, I'd never let it slide," another replied, the tone pulsing with years of repressed fury. The comments only grew harsher. Some called Blake a coward. Others said this wasn't just a single man's act, but proof of a system that had nurtured rotten power. Behind every line of text and furious emoji was a truth that couldn't be denied. The entire community had now seen what Blake and Hart once believed would be forgotten on the street. The video didn't just stay among friends and locals. It quickly crossed the city's borders. People who had once been stopped for no reason, searched because of their skin, immediately saw themselves in Talia's place. They shared the video with stories of their own, each one echoing the same humiliation she had faced. A middle-aged woman wrote, "I was once pulled out of my car for nothing watching this. I saw myself years ago." Those stories built up, turning the comment section into a wall of collective wounds now displayed openly for the world to witness. Meanwhile, civil rights groups couldn't stay silent. Their official accounts were immediately tagged in the original post. Notification after notification popped up at civil rights, now at justice. For all you need to see this. Within hours, pages with hundreds of thousands of followers had reposted the clip, adding sharp captions, "This isn't instinct, this is racism. Living proof of blatant abuse of power." Hashtags calling for justice and equality quickly climbed to the top of local trends and began spreading across the state. At cafes, people talked about it more than the morning news. A group of college students sat around a table rewatching the clip while typing comments, their faces tense. A corner store owner watched it on his phone, sighing and shaking his head again and again. Even on buses, passengers whispered among themselves, phones passed hand to hand, so everyone could see. The video had broken through the digital barrier of social media and crept into daily life, forcing even the indifferent to pay attention. Talia sat in her small apartment, the glow of the screen reflecting off a tired but resolute face. She watched the share count rise, watched the comments surge in like waves. For a moment, she felt a tremor of fear. Things had gone further than expected. It was no longer just between her and Blake, but had become a fire tearing through the long-standing wall of silence. But that fear quickly turned into resolve. She knew that once the truth was out, there would be no turning back, and that was exactly what she had chosen. Inside the offices of civil rights organizations, the video played on large screens on repeat. Activists gathered their voices, a mix of outrage and strategy. They saw not just an attack in that footage, but a chance to shake the system. Emails were typed, rapidly sent to journalists, city council members, and lawmakers. "We have the evidence. We have witnesses. We cannot miss this moment," one organizer said firmly. At the same time, at police headquarters, the media team began fielding a flood of calls. "Do you have a comment about the video? Does the department acknowledge this was misconduct?" Pressure came from every direction, forcing those used to public silence to face a storm head-on. Blake, unaware that morning, showed up to work with his usual smug demeanor, but around him the stares had shifted, some curious, some wary, and more than a few avoiding his gaze entirely. Online, the debate grew more intense by the hour. Some demanded the immediate suspension of Blake and Hart. Others called for prosecution. Still others urged people to take to the streets in protest. Fiery messages appeared again and again. "We can't stay silent any longer. A kick to her is a kick to all of us." These words were repeated, shared, and bolded like slogans. The video didn't just expose violence, it had become a symbol of injustice that had to be broken. In the middle of the uproar, Talia remained publicly silent. She watched quietly, didn't intervene, letting the momentum rise on its own. But inside, she knew clearly this was only the beginning. The fire had been lit, and from now on all eyes would turn toward Blake Hart and the system that had allowed them to act without consequence. What happened yesterday morning had become the concern of an entire city, an entire community, and no one could look away anymore. The third-floor conference room at police headquarters that morning felt like a sealed box filled with so much pressure that every breath inside came heavy. Sunlight filtered through the large windows behind the presiding seat, no longer crisp but dulled by the city's fine dust, casting muted gray beams into the air. The long table, coated in dark polished wood, reflected only cold, tense, uneasy faces. A few tablets lay on the surface screens, frozen on the frame from the now infamous video that had outraged the entire state. The screen was still, but the tension beneath it moved like an undertow ready to break at any moment. Blake sat on the right side, his posture carrying the same arrogant ease he had shown in past interrogations. He leaned back in his chair, arms folded, eyes indifferent as if he had done nothing wrong. But when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of deflection. "She was acting suspicious, showing resistance. I responded based on professional instinct." His tone was firm, but in the room the words landed like a paper-thin excuse, empty in front of the eyes locked on him. Blake's eyes scanned the room, searching for a familiar nod of agreement. Usually, in closed-door meetings, there would be at least a few colleagues with half-smirks or slight nods, silent signals of support. But today there was nothing. Some stared down, pretending to read documents. Others crossed their arms and looked up at the ceiling. No one spoke, no one stepped in. Blake felt a chill crawl slowly down his spine. At the head of the table, the senior commander sat upright, fingers interlocked on the tabletop. His hair was streaked with gray, and his face bore the lines of years spent answering for difficult situations. His eyes, behind silver-rimmed glasses, locked onto Blake's, and his voice dropped low, but each word landed like a hammer. Instinct. The whole state is watching that clip, Blake. Do you really think anyone still believes in your so-called instinct when thousands of eyes have seen exactly what happened? The voice echoed through the room. Blake flinched slightly, then clenched his jaw. His reflex to dominate and control made him hold his ground, but in his eyes, a flicker of unease appeared. Hart sat on the left, pale-faced. He hunched his shoulders, hands resting on his thighs, fingers tapping a frantic rhythm. He had barely spoken the entire time. He avoided Blake's gaze, avoided the commander's eyes fixed on a small scratch in the table's surface. In his mind, the image of blood running down Talia's forehead kept replaying. Her low voice, "This day will come back to you suddenly," rang in his ears so clear it made him swallow hard, throat dry. He wanted to speak, wanted to confess something, but fear and pressure held him tight like ropes pulled taut around his chest. The silence in the conference room was thick. Only the soft tapping of the commander's pen against the table broke through it steady like the countdown to a slow-burning fuse. He exhaled, his voice hard as stone. "You're dragging the entire department into a hole. Blake, the media's closing in, the public is outraged, and civil rights organizations are on it. We're no longer just talking about the actions of one officer. This is about the credibility of the entire force." Blake clenched his jaw, lips pressed tight. He wanted to argue, but he had run out of ground. The video was undeniable, public opinion unshakable, and now even the familiar support of fellow officers was gone. Rage surged in his chest, but Blake knew that anger would only sink him deeper. Just then, the conference room door swung open. A young officer rushed in, face flushed, sweat on his brow. He paused, caught his breath, then delivered the urgent update. "Outside. There's a crowd gathering at the station entrance. They're holding signs, chanting, demanding answers now. The numbers rising by the minute." The report hit like a bomb in an already tense room. The commander's brow furrowed instantly, and his hands slammed onto the table. He stared directly at Blake, his voice sharp and deliberate. "Do you see now this is no longer a minor incident? People are at our doorstep demanding accountability." Outside, through the thick glass, the sounds began to cut through chants layered over the blare of traffic. At first, scattered, but quickly united into a single booming rhythm. Justice for Talia. Justice for all of us. The voices echoed off the concrete walls, spilled into the meeting room, making the air inside even more suffocating. Blake sat frozen, fists clenched, jaw tight with tension. He wanted to shout that it was all exaggerated, that the crowd didn't understand. But even he could hear the fury outside, and he knew exaggeration couldn't have stirred a storm this fierce. Hart kept his head down, hands trembling, sweat glistening on his forehead. He could feel the collapse coming and the fear squeezed at his chest. The chants outside continued pounding like war drums. Signs rose high, footsteps thudded with force, all of it pressing down in a way none of them had ever experienced. Inside the room, those in uniform no longer felt like they stood on solid ground, but like prey cornered by something closing in. Their eyes met, but there was no trust left, only tension and unease. And in that moment, they all understood a crack had formed within. A crack not just in the video, but in the way these uniformed men and women were confronting the truth. It would spread, breaking apart what they once believed in, paving the way for a crisis unlike anything they had ever faced. 2 days after the incident, the city's tension hadn't eased. At the commercial street corner, where Talia's blood had once stained the cement, the marks still lingered, and people passing by continued to glance over and whisper. The online wave remained relentless, with tens of thousands of shares turning the video into a focal point, not just an isolated event, but a public conversation about justice. Amid that backdrop, the small cafe directly across from the scene suddenly became the new center center of attention. There, a young man, the one who had filmed the original clip, decided to speak. He sat in the back corner, shirt, wrinkled fingers tightly wrapped around a coffee cup, but his eyes burned with resolve. Journalists and a few locals gathered around. His voice dropped low, yet clear enough for all to hear. I was afraid of being dragged into it, afraid of the trouble if the police found out I was the one who filmed. But silence is worse. That scene can't be buried like so many others. His words rang out not loud but heavy as stone, bringing the small room to stillness. Some people exchanged glances and nodded as if a burden had been slightly lifted. From one individual, the truth became a public stand, pulling the community to Talia's side. The cafe grew even quieter when a young mother entered with her daughter. The girl, about 7 years old, wide-eyed, clung to her mother's hand. When she saw a few reporters asking questions, she suddenly spoke up, her small voice cutting through like a blade. Why did he kick her? The question, simple and unarmed by logic or evidence, silenced every adult in the room. The mother, startled, lowered her head, gripped her daughter's hand tightly, trying to guide her to a seat. But the girl's round eyes still scanned the room, waiting for someone to answer in place of the heavy silence. In that moment, it became clear that this was no longer just about a police officer and a woman. It had been etched into the memory of a generation. And if even a child was asking questions, adults could no longer look away. The impact deepened when a reporter decided to live stream directly from the cafe. The camera switched on, panning across the young man's face, then to the mother and child, and finally to the silent customers watching everything unfold. Within minutes, the live view count shot to past 20,000. Viewers didn't just watch, they filled the screen with comments, "He's brave for coming forward." The child asked the real question, "Justice can't be delayed anymore." The live stream became living proof of a community beginning to speak for itself. Amid the stream of comments, many people began tagging civil rights organizations and major news outlets directly. The video from the cafe spread quickly like new fuel poured onto a fire already burning. Old hashtags surged back to the top, now joined by a new question. If a child can understand, why can't the police admit it? Public pressure intensified, with every passing minute weighing heavier and heavier on the shoulders of the police department. The news reached leadership quickly. In an emergency meeting, live updates were presented one after another, all confirming the same truth. The outrage was spiraling out of control. Veteran officers exchanged glances, their expressions heavy. The commander slammed his hand on the table and finally made the call, temporarily suspend Blake and Hart. There's no other option. His voice was cold, but beneath it was resignation. Blake, once the man who walked into any meeting with smug confidence, had become a liability. Hart, timid and silent, was swept into the same storm with nowhere left to hide. Once the decision was made, a press statement was drafted immediately. Within hours, the entire city received the news the two officers involved in the incident had been suspended pending investigation. Outside the station, the crowd erupted, signs raised, high applause mixed with shout. To them, it was only the first step, a small concession, but it marked the beginning of a justice wave, shaking the walls they once thought unbreakable. In the cafe, when the news came through, the young man sat, still fingers tight around his coffee cup, lips curling into a tired smile. He knew now that his choice to speak hadn't been in vain. The young mother held her child close, her eyes still heavy but softened. And the little girl, hearing part of the conversation, chirped innocently, "Did they get punished?" "Mom." The question made a few people laugh bitterly, but everyone understood a larger one now lingered in the room. Was that punishment enough? Across the city, Talia sat in front of her computer screen, eyes fixed on the steady stream of news. When the official announcement appeared, she didn't smile, didn't cheer. Her gaze dropped quiet and steady because she knew this was only the beginning. The full truth hadn't yet been revealed, justice hadn't yet arrived, and the road ahead was long. But in her chest, there was a flicker of light because finally what she endured hadn't been buried, but had become the spark for something greater. The sounds of traffic still hummed outside, but in the city's atmosphere a shift could be felt. The crowd was growing, the witness had spoken, and a child's innocent question had taken root in the heart of a community. This wave would not stop at temporary decisions, it would rise and crash through the long-standing walls that protected abuse. And in the center of it all, Talia knew she had just stepped through the first door of a journey, one where each step would grow heavier but also clearer. The branch office of a major private security corporation sat atop a glass tower in the heart of the city. That afternoon, sunlight cut through the transparent windows, casting reflections across the neatly arranged desks, the golden light spilling onto the walls like a reminder that this was a place of power and secrecy far beyond what the outside world imagined. In the still air, a thick dossier sat before the board of directors. On the cover, the name Talia Brooks was printed in bold, stamped with a red seal confirming her new title, Director of City Branch Security. The background information inside was not something most people knew. Long before the street incident sparked outrage, Talia had already been a seasoned internal investigation specialist with an impressive record, having handled numerous corporate scandals. She wasn't a helpless civilian forced into victimhood. She was a professional long accustomed to confronting corruption and abuse. The file listed her collaborations with audit agencies, her exposure of fraudulent operations, and reports she authored that had forced high-ranking executives to step down. Every line confirmed what Blake and Hart never realized: Talia had never been powerless. Around the room, board members turned pages in silence, pausing at the long list of investigations bearing her signature. One senior executive nodded slowly. She has more than just experience, she has endurance. Someone like that, if determined, can turn a single incident into a full-blown reform. No one disagreed. The truth was clear: the woman who had been kicked down in the street days earlier now sat in a leadership seat within the very organization working with the city to rebuild its security order. While the media continued to focus on the video and the suspensions, Talia quietly stepped into her new office, eyes sweeping past the wide glass window over the city below. She said nothing publicly, never revealing her true position. Blake's insults still echoed, but she felt no urgency to respond. What she held now wasn't just evidence, it was legitimate authority. Her silence was a strategy, a move in a game she now controlled. In a closed internal meeting, a colleague asked, "Should we announce your new position and confront them directly?" Talia shook her head, eyes resolute. "Not yet. Let them figure out who's sitting in the upper chair. When the truth reveals itself, the fall will hurt 10 times more." Her voice was low and steady, each word sharp as a cold blade. Her team exchanged glances, understanding that she wasn't choosing spectacle. She was choosing to let the truth speak for itself when the time was right. The strategy of silence wasn't about avoidance, but about extending public attention, allowing the pressure on the police department to intensify. With each passing day, public suspicion and outrage grew, and when Talia's true position was finally revealed, it would land like a final blow, leaving those once smug with no escape. In the polished stillness of that office, Talia knew the game had changed. On the chessboard of power, she was no longer a pawn crushed underfoot. She now sat at the helm, waiting for the right moment to strike. Inside the corporation's small meeting room, the air thickened as some stacks of documents spread across the table. Talia's attorney, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes, carefully reviewed every clip, every witness statement from that day. He said little underlining key lines in the files, then looked up slowly. "We have the viral footage, but I want more pieces. Storefront security footage, The testimony of the mother and child, even the live streams from the cafe. Once everything is tied together, there will be no room left for denial. Talia listened, eyes fixed on the file. Every listed item was another link tightening around Blake and Hart and around the police department, which would find this case harder to bury than the ones before. Beside them, a young assistant kept feeding in updates from social media. Links were logged, critical comments captured and archived, all forming a digital dossier. Talia watched, hands clasped calmly on the table, saying nothing until the lawyer offered his next proposal. It's time to schedule a formal meeting with the police department. Not public, but direct enough to let them know we're prepared. If they think they can stall, they'll be mistaken. The remark pierced straight through the arrogance long ingrained in the department, and Talia nodded slightly, the decision made. That afternoon, the corporation's office reached out directly to the command secretary at police headquarters. No public announcements, no press coverage, just a brief message requesting urgent meeting regarding current security and order status. Branch Director Talia Brooks will attend. The words were composed and steady but carried unmistakable weight. When the police secretary received it, there was a pause, just a few seconds, but enough to register the significance of the name. Talia Brooks now echoed across headlines inseparable from the image of the woman in the video that had shaken the city. Talia sat in her private office when the response from the police department arrived. The meeting was scheduled for Monday morning at headquarters. She read the document carefully, folded it, and placed it on the desk, her gaze unwavering. In her mind, the scenario had already been mapped out, the evidence would be laid out in sequence, the questions fired like arrows, and finally her true identity would be revealed as a blow no one saw coming. In that moment, not only Blake and Hart, but every shadowed figure who once laughed behind her back would be brought into the light. That night, Talia didn't sleep right away. She stood by the window looking out at the city lights below, her heart restless knowing a turning point was near. She recalled the words she once said to Blake, "This day will come back to you." Now, it was no longer a simple warning, but a promise come due. The silence of the past few days had been the necessary retreat so that today she could step forward with full power in hand. The files, the testimonies, the videos all had stacked into a wall of irrefutable proof, and in the meeting ahead, that wall would come crashing down in the center of the room, forcing those who once stood proud to realize the game had changed hands. On Monday morning, the police department headquarters buzzed with a heavy atmosphere. Outside, protesters continued to gather with raised signs, their chants for justice echoing through the glass doors. Inside, in the main conference room, a long table with carefully arranged chairs lined up in order, water, and documents already set in place. This meeting had been announced as critically important as the city had just launched a public safety reform project in response to the intense backlash. All senior officers were present, including Blake and Hart, both recently suspended and summoned to attend in the capacity of being questioned. None of them knew this morning would mark a turning point. The chairperson opened with a solemn tone, eyes sweeping across every face in the room. Today, we welcome the new head of the Public Safety Reform Project, who will work directly with the city and our private security partner to ensure transparency in all procedures. This is a non-negotiable step in restoring public trust. A few officers murmured to one another, uneasy about the idea of added external oversight, though none yet suspected who the guest might be. Blake sat near the end of the table, hands clasped tightly, his expression stiff. He believed he was being made a scapegoat, but reassured himself they won't dare go too far. Hart was different, pale, and avoiding eye contact as if hoping the meeting would pass quietly. The conference room doors swung open. A woman walked in, slow and poised, her footsteps echoing clearly in the silence. Morning light streamed through the window behind her, casting a glow on her face where a red scar still marked her forehead, not yet faded from that brutal kick. It was Talia Brooks. The room froze in an instant. All murmurs ceased, every gaze fixed on the woman who had just entered. A few officers immediately immediately recognized her as the central figure in the viral video, their faces draining of color. Blake sat in stunned silence as if all the blood had left his body. Talia didn't smile, nor did she play to the moment. She set a folder on the table, pulled her chair in, and calmly scanned the room with a steady gaze. The silence grew almost suffocating until the chairperson spoke again. "Allow me to introduce Ms. Talia Brooks, Director of City Branch Security for our partner organization, who will lead the implementation of the local reform project." The introduction landed like a thunderclap, freezing every eye on Talia. Blake sat frozen. He had once acted with confidence when kicking that woman in the stomach on the street, once scoffing as he claimed it was an officer's instinct. Now, the very person he had scorned sat in a position of authority, her gaze calm but sharp as a blade. Hart lowered his head slightly, his shoulders trembling, avoiding Talia's eyes like dodging a sword ready to strike. The room felt suspended in time, every heartbeat echoing in the minds of those sitting on the defensive side. Talia spoke, her voice low but steady. "We are here to talk about the rules of power and consequences. This is not just a meeting, but the first step in proving that the order of justice is no longer neglected." Her voice wasn't loud, but each word landed on the wooden table like a heavy stone, unsettling many. An older officer coughed quietly, trying to find comfort, but his eyes never left the scar on Talia's forehead. That image stood as living evidence, rendering any excuse meaningless. In the minutes that followed, Talia did not mention her personal incident, but addressed the need for reform. She pointed out procedural gaps, weaknesses that gave rise to abuse of authority. She emphasized accountability and the need for transparency in every officer's actions before the public. But what kept everyone silent was the way she spoke. No tremble, no threat, only the certainty of someone who had risen from her wounds. Every time her eyes passed over Blake, his face tensed further, sweat collecting along his temples. A moment later, Blake tried to regain control, forcing a smirk. "So a victim will now lead the reform. I'm afraid personal feelings might cloud your objectivity." The room turned to him, a few faces shocked by his reckless arrogance. Talia slowly spun the pen in her fingers, offering a faint smile. "If objectivity means ignoring the truth, I'll gladly be subjective. And if you call me a victim, remember, today's victim is tomorrow's leader." Her direct response stirred a wave of murmurs across the room. Some nodded quietly as if they had found a way out of their own silence through her words. The meeting's chair quickly stepped in, redirecting the discussion. But the reality was the tone in the room had changed entirely. No one saw Talia as a witness to protect anymore, but as an authority imposing discipline. Her presence wasn't just a surprise. It was a shock that forced a shift in perspective. The room, once a bastion of police authority, had become a stage where abusers of power were now under the spotlight. Outside the hallway, a few staff who heard Talia had shown up as the new leader hurried to text their colleagues. News leaked within moments, and soon after, social media lit up again. Short but powerful updates appeared. "She's the new boss. Justice just turned around." The public's outrage turned to vindication as the community felt it was witnessing a historic turning point. In the meeting room, Talia ended her opening remarks with a statement that left the entire board holding its breath. "Reform isn't about bringing anyone down, it's about rebuilding trust. But if anyone still believes power is a weapon to trample others, then be prepared to face the consequences." Her eyes swept past Blake, pausing long enough to make him drop his gaze. The room went completely silent, and everyone understood that the days of comfort within the police department were officially over. That morning's meeting became a turning point, not because of the numbers in the reports, but because of the moment a victim stood tall in a position of leadership. The shock didn't come from the data, from the reality that Talia, the woman with the red scar on her forehead, now held power in her hands. And from that moment on, no one could underestimate her or the community she represented. This was no longer the game of a few individuals. It had become a battle to redefine the city's justice system. Blake leaned back in his chair, but his shoulders were stiff as stone. His fingers interlocked so tightly beneath the table that his knuckles turned white. Hart, beside him, fared no better. His eyes locked on the dark wooden surface, avoiding contact with anyone. Both were used to walking into meetings with the control in their hands, but now they sat completely exposed like students being reprimanded in front of the class. Neither dared glance at Talia because they knew the moment they met her eyes, they would have to face a truth that made them tremble. The quiet click of Talia's pen between her fingers drew focus across the room, adding to their suffocating discomfort. The tension was so thick it could be sliced until Talia paused, set the pen down, and spoke. Her voice was low, firm, each word ringing out like a bell against stone walls. "We're here to talk about the rules of power and consequences." The sentence was neither long nor ornate, but its weight left the room in stunned silence. Each word landed like a reminder that the old era where power allowed the strong to dominate had ended. No one moved, only the quickened breath of Hart slipped out like a crack in the silence. Blake clenched his fists, palms slick with sweat, though his face strained to remain unreadable. He felt exposed under the gaze of the board as if stripped bare. Talia's remarks hadn't addressed him directly, but he knew every word struck at the core of the officer persona he once wore with pride. Hart simply kept his head bowed, his back slightly hunched as if trying to shrink out of sight before the storm hit. But the more he tried to disappear, the more the truth closed in, weighing heavily on his chest. The other officers in the room, who had remained silent until now, began to stir slightly. A few leaned back in their chairs, others clasped their hands in front of them, all waiting to see how Talia would proceed. The way she had entered the room with that red scar on her forehead had already made it clear that the truth could no longer be denied. And now, with her brief opening, she not only set the agenda for the meeting, but also established a new order in the room, one where power no longer belonged to those who assumed privilege, but to justice and truth. No one laughed, no one dared interrupt. Even the commander, who was used to running the room, now sat upright, eyes locked on Talia, as if to prove he was paying attention. Outside, the chants from the protest still echoed through the thick glass, blending with Talia's voice into a heavy rhythm that pushed forward. In that moment, the room felt like a stage where those who once held authority were forced into silence, while a woman who had been trampled became the voice leading them forward. Blake glanced at Hart, eyes filled with frustration, as if urging him to rise up and fight back, but Hart only shook his head slightly, eyes still cast downward. The contrast in their reactions made them seem even more isolated in the larger picture. Talia's words had sealed off every exit, because now no one could pretend that the kick on the street was a minor incident. They all understood that what was about to be discussed wasn't a workplace mishap, but the truth about a warped power culture finally facing its reckoning. In the long pause that followed her words, everyone in the room became aware that nothing from this point on would be the same. Talia's opening didn't just start a meeting, it launched a new era, one where consequences would come for those who had long escaped them. The internal affairs room was locked tight. Soft yellow light from the ceiling cast in a warm glow over case files and a long wooden table covered in paperwork. A slogan about integrity hung on the wall, but this was now the place to dig deep into the cracks within the police ranks. Talia sat with the team of investigators facing a line of witnesses called in to give formal statements. The first was the young man who had filmed the video at the cafe, his hand trembling as he placed it on the Bible to swear in. His voice was hoarse. "I saw everything from the start, saw the kick, saw the blood. I filmed it because I knew without proof no one would ever believe her." The room was completely silent, every word carefully recorded and entered into the file with the signed confirmation. The next witnesses came in one by one, from the mother walking her daughter past the scene to the employee at a nearby store. each account, each angle came together to form a complete picture of the event. Some said they heard the shouting, others recalled the moment the little girl asked why did he kick her, and the crowd fell silent. Every testimony was added to the growing file page by page, increasing the weight of the truth. Talia watched attentively, her expression calm, but her eyes steady and resolute as she followed each account. Once the final witness left, the team moved on to verifying footage from security cameras around the block. The large screen lit up the images, grainy at first, but as they slowed, the playback details sharpened from multiple angles. The actions of Blake and Hart were clearly captured. Blake's kick appeared in footage from at least 3 different cameras, each frame an undeniable piece of evidence. In another view, Hart was seen pinning Talia against a glass wall, his face expressionless, but with a flicker of hesitation. The room fell still as the images aligned perfectly with the witness testimonies. Talia leaned in, jotting notes in her small notebook, her gaze now sharp as a blade. Those angles didn't just confirm the truth, they stripped away every excuse the 2 officers had clung to. The lead investigator exhaled quietly, flipping to the next page of the report, his voice steady but tense. "We have enough grounds to proceed to the next phase." On the table, the file's transcripts and camera data sat neatly stacked, carrying a weight far beyond their appearance. The small, quiet room had now triggered an irreversible process, pushing Blake and Hart closer to a public hearing where the truth would be laid bare before the entire community. Each new case file was added, each witness statement numbered, followed by printed footage from security cameras and technical verification reports, all stacked into neat columns on the long wooden table. The piles of paper grew taller, rising above the sightlines of some investigators, seated at the far end like a mountain of evidence weighing down on the fate of Blake and Hart. Talia quietly observed her eyes following each new document placed on the table, every file another link in a tightening chain, leaving no room for escape from the truth. The silence in the investigation room was no longer one of vague tension, but of cold certainty, a truth so stark it rendered every attempt at denial meaningless. The lead investigator sat at the head of the table, fingers tapping lightly against the wood, his gaze fixed on the rising stacks. He spoke slowly, his voice hoarse, firm. "We have enough, more than enough." The simple statement thickened the air in the room because everyone understood this was the turning point. The case had moved beyond the bounds of an internal matter, now stepping into the realm of public accountability. Talia took a deep breath, feeling her heartbeat steady and deliberate, with a clear thought echoing within. Justice was near, not as a vague hope, but as a tangible force taking shape on the black and white pages before her. Another member of the investigative team closed a folder, looked around the room, and said, "It's time the public saw the whole truth. We can't let this case end in the dark." His words were met with nods of agreement. The meeting quickly moved to its final decision, and a sentence was written on the board's scheduled public hearing. The lead investigator's hand trembled slightly as he signed the order, not from hesitation, but because he knew the impact of this decision would stretch far beyond the 4 walls of this modest room. Talia looked at the towering stack of files, now so high they blocked the view of the wall behind them. A feeling rose in her, heavy yet quietly freeing. She knew the fight wasn't over, but with the hearing set and the evidence in place, the path to justice could no longer be obscured. In that moment, the entire room seemed to pause, then released a collective breath, as if they had all glimpsed the first ray of light breaking through the dense fog. And Talia, eyes glowing with clarity, understood from this point forward the truth would never again be buried. The City Hall auditorium was packed that day, every seat filled, reporters scrambling for the best positions, cameras lined up in rows at the back, and the bright lighting made the already tense atmosphere even more suffocating. Citizens from many neighborhoods had come, some carrying signs calling for justice. Others sitting silently, waiting for the critical moment. When the large screen at the front lit up, the room fell into near total silence. The familiar clip played every detail clear, Blake delivering a kick to Talia's stomach, the heavy sound echoing, then blood trailing down her face. No sound came from the audience, only a few sharp breaths, pens tapping on reporters' notepads, and stunned expressions from those who had never seen the full incident before. The footage, though widely circulated on social media, carried a different weight here in this solemn setting, becoming a living piece of evidence that struck straight to the core. When the clip ended, Blake sat at the front of the hearing table, his face, rigid eyes avoiding the crowd. He adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and began speaking, trying to remain calm. "I acted for public safety." His words rang out clearly, but were instantly met with murmurs from the audience. A few scoffs came from the back rows, and some shook their heads in dismay. Reporters quickly jotted down the quote, as if they had already predicted Blake would fall back on the same old defense. Blake attempted to elaborate his tone, turning more urgent. "That woman appeared in the commercial district acting suspiciously. I had a duty to react quickly to protect those around. In that moment, I acted on the instincts of a police officer." The words seemed more like a self-justification than a persuasive defense. The crowd remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of watching the clip. It was a silence full of restrained outrage. They were listening, but not empathizing. Some members of the hearing board exchanged glances, then one spoke, voice measured but firm. "You call that instinct, but the video shows nothing but unprovoked violence. Do you have any evidence beyond your personal feelings?" The question landed like a knife slicing through the thin layer of excuse Blake was trying to build. He paused, lips pressed tight, hands clasped together to hide their tremble. He tried to speak again, but the crowd had begun to stir with harsh whispers, some murmuring, "If that's what public safety looks like, we don't want it." The atmosphere in the auditorium grew heavier, the gap between what the clip revealed and Blake's justification too wide for anyone to accept. The phrase, "I acted for public safety," had become an empty excuse, no longer able to mask an act that was already too clear. And in that very moment, Talia knew everything was beginning to tip toward the truth, because deception, no matter how eloquently worded, could not withstand the light of justice once it had been clearly shown to the public. Talia sat across from Blake, her eyes unwavering, voice steady and sharp as steel. Safety doesn't come from an unprovoked kick. The statement landed like a hammer on the flimsy defense Blake had just tried to build, shaking the entire room. The thick tension broke into two opposing waves at the front rows. Many people jumped to their feet, clapping thunderously, the sound echoing through the chamber like thunder splitting the sky. But within that eruption were shouts of protest, a few still clinging to blind loyalty toward the police image they once trusted, their cries tangled with the cheers in a clash both fierce and volatile. The auditorium lights cast a glow on Talia's face, highlighting the scar on her forehead, the mark left by the very kick Blake had tried to frame as professional instinct. That scar glinted under the lights, a vivid testament truth could not be distorted. Those present saw not just a woman standing against injustice, but a living symbol of someone who dared to confront and call out lies. Her voice wasn't loud or angry, but each word landed with weight, compelling even the most skeptical to nod in agreement. Blake, faced with that rebuttal, suddenly looked smaller than ever. He glanced around and met the eyes of the council, the press, and the public. Every look was a blade cutting through the pretense he was trying to maintain. The applause hadn't died down, and chants of justice began rising from one corner of the hall, spreading until they drowned out the scattered voices of dissent. The auditorium became a battlefield of words where truth and falsehood clashed, and clearly the balance had shifted to Talia's side. The presiding officer had to strike the gavel repeatedly to regain order, but the echo of clapping and chanting still lingered, spilling into the homes of viewers watching the live stream. Thousands were seeing, hearing, witnessing a moment where someone who once claimed power over others' lives was being publicly unmasked. Talia sat back down, spine straight, eyes forward, knowing this was no longer a personal story. It had become proof to an entire city that justice still held meaning, so long as someone dared to stand up and speak the truth. Late at night, Talia's office was bathed in the warm glow of a small desk lamp, the room silent except for the soft tapping of keys and the rustle of paper. Outside, the city had settled after a chaotic day filled with news from the hearing, but inside that room, Talia patiently sifted through file after file. These documents, buried for years in the police department's drawers, now sat heavily on her desk like a chronicle of abuse and misconduct. She turned each page, reading the stiff handwriting of former investigators, and saw one undeniable truth: what Blake and Hart had done was not an isolated incident, but part of a long chain of cases that were overlooked, blurred, or deliberately buried. The first file described a young black man stopped in the middle of the street 5 years ago with Blake listed as the respondent officer. The report offered just 4 words: suspicious behavior, but witness statements revealed the young man had been pulled from his car, forced to kneel on the asphalt in front of dozens of onlookers. The file ended with no further evidence, case closed. Talia placed the file back on the desk, her eyes darkening. She understood that the silence of those earlier years was what had allowed the kicks, the insults, and the abuse of today to happen. She opened another file, this one a complaint from an elderly woman who had her handbag searched in a supermarket by Hart. The report claimed subject overreacted, officer used necessary inspection, but beneath that was a handwritten note from a witness saying the woman cried while Hart laughed. The case was dismissed as a minor misunderstanding and never brought up again. Talia read with her throat tightening as if an invisible hand was gripping it. She remembered Hart's lowered eyes at the hearing, the fear and helplessness that radiated from him, and understood his complicity hadn't started from one moment, but from a habit long forced upon him. The more old records she uncovered, the angrier Talia's anger grew. She realized this wasn't a battle between her and 2 officers. It was a fight against a system that had allowed truth to be ignored. She carefully sorted each file, marking the cases where witnesses were still alive or could be found. On the desk, papers spread out in clusters, one side labeled possible contacts, the other requires verification. A clear picture emerged: the truth had never disappeared. It had only been buried, and her job now was to dig up every fragment and piece them into a complete map. The clock neared midnight, but Talia remained at her desk. She opened her computer, searching for contact information tied to names listed in the old files. Some had moved away, others had left the city to escape painful memories, and some still lived here but had remained silent for years. Talia drafted each email, typed out each message, her words firm yet empathetic. "This is Talia Brooks. I'm revisiting your case. There is now a chance for justice to speak. I'd like to invite you to add your voice." She knew not everyone would be ready, but every message sent was a small light pushing back the darkness that had lingered for far too long. After several hours, the first reply came from an unfamiliar number. It was the young man who had once been pulled over, now a grown man with a steady, grounded voice. "I stayed silent for 5 years, but seeing you in that hall made me realize it's time to speak up." Another response came from the woman in the supermarket, her voice trembling over the phone. "I didn't think anyone would believe me, but if you're speaking, then I will too." Talia leaned back in her chair, eyes closed for a moment, feeling each reply like a stream of clean water washing the dust off long-forgotten pages. Still, not everyone was willing. Some declined outright, and a few hung up mid-call, afraid of retaliation. Talia understood fear had gripped them for years, and she held no anger. Every call that ended in silence reminded her that this responsibility was heavier than ever. She noted each response, circled the names of those who agreed, and began outlining the next step, preparing a full report to present before the city commission. That night, Talia's small office became more than just a workspace. It became a front line. Every file, every phone call, every email sent felt like a bullet fired into the dark, into the thick wall of abuse that had stood untouched for too long. She knew the road ahead would be filled with obstacles, but when she looked at the scar on her forehead, she felt she no longer had the right to be tired. The victims from years past were waiting, and so was the community. Outside her window, the city lights had faded, leaving only a few flickering street lamps. Inside, the glow from her desk lamp still burned, illuminating the figure of a woman seated before a mountain of files. Each old page returning to her desk carried not just truth, but the longing to make things right. And Talia, in the quiet hours of the night, quietly turned each fragment into a weapon for what tomorrow would bring, when justice would no longer be a promise, but a presence all could see. In the brightly lit room, old and new case files covered the entire surface of the desk as Talia began the most difficult stage, drafting a comprehensive report strong enough to present before the city commission. She sat upright, eyes focused, pen underlining key details, and her computer open with the document already taken shape. What lay before her wasn't just hundreds of dry pages, it was the story of people long forgotten, the silent wounds of an entire community. Talia knew each word she wrote wasn't just a sentence, but would become a living piece of evidence, forcing the system to bow its head. The work stretched on for hours, starting with organizing cases chronologically from years past to the present. She carefully connected seemingly isolated incidents to prove that these were not just isolated acts, but part of a systemic pattern of abuse sustained by cover-ups and silence. Each case was supported by witness statements, photos, and cross-referenced with discrepancies in the original police reports. When she finished the first section, Talia sat still for a few minutes, her eyes burning, knowing these stories should have surfaced long ago before more people were harmed. The more she wrote, the more she felt the weight of every detail. Cases once marked as insufficient evidence were now backed by new testimonies she had gathered, and vague reports were clarified with videos and photos from residents. Talia missed nothing. She dedicated entire sections to analyzing how officers like Blake and Hart had exploited their authority, from random ID checks, unjustified searches, to outright public violence. The report was becoming a massive mirror reflecting their true faces, undeniable and clear. Once the main content was complete, Talia added the conclusion in a concise yet firm tone. These incidents, past and present, prove a systemic abuse of power within the police force. Silence can no longer continue. We urge the City Commission to initiate a full reform, hold violators accountable, and restore trust in the community. She read every word again, refining the language for precision, then saved the draft in multiple formats and printed a version hundreds of pages thick. It was late into the night, but Talia didn't allow herself to rest. She checked each table of contents, marked every referenced document, and organized everything into a large file folder with a dark blue cover labeled Comprehensive Report on Abuse of Power. As she looked at the neatly bound stack of papers, she exhaled deeply, eyes bright with resolve. This wasn't just her work, it was the voice of so many who had been silenced. The parking lot was quiet at night, the overhead lights casting pale yellow streaks across the ground, the shadows of cars stretched into distorted shapes. The silence was so deep that even the wind rustling through the trees sounded sharp. Talia walked slowly toward her car after a long day of work, her mind still swirling with plans for the next steps in the legal battle. She suddenly noticed a figure leaning against the last concrete pillar in the lot. The posture was awkward, hands stuffed in pockets, silence, head slightly bowed. As she drew closer, she recognized Hart, the officer who had been with Blake during the assault that day. The light cast a weary look across Hart's face, dark circles under his eyes and unshaven stubble betraying his disarray. When he saw Talia, he flinched but didn't run. Instead, he stood still, taking a deep breath like he'd been waiting for this moment. "I need to talk to you, Hart," said his voice hoarse and slightly trembling. Talia stopped keeping a careful distance, her gaze wary, but not afraid. "You think there's anything left to say between us?" she asked, her tone steady. Hart looked down, his hands clenching and unclenching before he finally said, "I can't stay silent anymore. I need to confess." The air grew thick, pressing on each breath. Hart looked up, his eyes lost but filled with guilt. "Blake, he controlled me from the moment I joined the department. He knew how to manipulate, how to instill fear. Anyone who stood up to him got isolated, even pushed out. I saw it happen, and I chose silence to protect my position. I followed him, even knowing he was wrong, because I was a coward." His voice cracked as if releasing a weight that had crushed him for years. Talia stood still, her eyes unblinking. What Hart said didn't surprise her. She had already suspected such a toxic dynamic existed, but hearing him admit it aloud left a bitter sting. "And what do you hope to gain by confessing now?" she asked, her tone unmoved. Hart swallowed hard, then replied, "'Cause I can't be complicit anymore. I let Blake do whatever he wanted, and I've hurt people through my silence. The culture inside the department taught us that people like you with your skin and your background should always be the first to be suspected. From training day, those things were whispered, passed down until they became reflexes. We weren't told outright, but everyone understood assume guilt first, justify later." Hart's words cut through the silence like blades. Talia slowly took a few more steps, closing the gap between them to just a few meters. Her gaze bore into him, quiet but razor sharp. "You let those twisted lessons define your career. You let them turn you into a compliant enabler for Blake instead of holding on to your conscience. You say you were a coward, but that cowardice left blood on my forehead and on the lives of others." Hart lowered his head, his shoulders trembling, his voice cracking. "I know. That's why I'm here. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted to bring what I know into the light. I'm willing to testify. I'll talk about the training sessions, the conversations at the precinct, the way Blake used power to suffocate anyone who tried to push back." Hart's confession hung in the air and echoed faintly, making the parking lot feel even more still. Talia looked at him, her eyes darkening, her mind torn. Part of her wanted to turn away to leave him drowning in his own guilt, but another part understood that while he was complicit, this confession could be a critical piece in exposing an entire corrupt system. She took a deep breath and said, "If you're serious, you'd better be ready. Once you speak up, there's no turning back. Blake will come for you, and so will the people behind him. And don't expect me to shield you. This will be entirely on you." Hart nodded his eyes, showing a flicker of resolve. "I understand. I've stayed silent for too long. Now I have to pay for that, and if speaking out can help bring you closer to justice, then I'm ready." Talia held his gaze for a moment longer, then turned and walked to her car. Before opening the door, she paused, her voice carrying through the cold air. "I'll contact my attorney. If you truly want to testify, I'll give you that chance. But remember, the truth is not an easy road." She stepped into the car, shut the door, and left Hart standing alone under the dim yellow light. The parking lot returned to silence. Only the wind remained sweeping away the words that had just been spoken. Hart stood still, his shoulders heavy, but for the first time his eyes reflected a hint of relief. He knew the road ahead would be harsh, but tonight, by confessing, he had taken the first step out of the darkness that Blake and the system had built around him. As for Talia, driving out of the lot, a thought echoed in her mind late. As it was, a former accomplice had finally spoken up, and that might be the crack that brings the entire wall down. Hart quietly pulled a folded bundle of papers from his jacket pocket, the pages creased and stained with smudged ink. He handed them to Talia, his hand trembling as if giving away a part of himself. "These are internal notes I kept. No one knows I made copies. If this gets out, my career is over. But maybe it's been over for a long time already." Talia took the papers, unfolded them, and skimmed through. The handwriting was rushed but clear enough to expose the underground culture. Hart had just admitted unspoken directives to focus checks on individuals with certain physical traits. Closed-door meetings where veteran officers passed down systematic suspicion to rookies. There were notes about Blake's behavior, how he forced others to follow suit, and even the names of those pushed out of the department for speaking up. Talia's eyes lingered on one page that read, "Never show weakness. The ones pulled aside first are always the ones who look different." The brief sentence hit with the weight of a hammer, tightening her chest. She folded the papers again, looked up at Hart, her voice low. "You realize if I use this, there's no way out for you?" Hart nodded, his eyes tired but resolute. "I've come this far. There's no turning back. If I have to, I'll speak in public. I don't want anyone else going through what you did." Talia remained silent for a long moment, gripping the notes tightly. The parking lot around them felt colder, as if daring her to choose. Bringing these documents to court would mean exposing the darkest parts of the entire police department, not just Blake or Hart. It would ignite a wave of backlash, unleashing consequences far beyond her control, but keeping them hidden would betray every victim who had stepped forward and betray herself. In her mind, she saw the people who had answered her calls, their shaky but determined voices, the eyes that had endured years of silence. She remembered the child's innocent question at the hearing, the lowered gaze of the young mother. Each memory struck like a blade, reminding her that justice couldn't come from half measures. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the notes like a stone in her hand, and said slowly, "If what's in here is true, we'll bring it to court. But you need to be ready, because when the light hits, it will burn away every shadow you've been hiding in." Hart nodded his eyes, reflecting a mix of fear and relief. Talia placed the papers in her bag, turned back toward her car, knowing this decision would change everything. That night, in a quiet parking lot, she held the final piece that could shift the entire balance, and her heart grew heavy with a single question: would justice be strong enough to break through all the forces waiting to bury it? The local courthouse was packed that morning, every wooden bench filled, while hundreds more gathered in the hallway watching the live broadcast. The tension in the air was tight as a wire, every eye fixed on the judge's bench. After days of investigation hearings and evidence gathering, this morning had arrived. The final verdict was about to be read. Talia sat in the front row, her face calm but eyes resolute. Hart sat at the defendant's table with his head lowered, fingers tightly interlaced, while Blake wore a mask of forced composure, though the deep lines at the corners of his eyes betrayed his mounting tension. The judge entered, and the bang of the gavel brought the courtroom to absolute silence. His voice rang out, each word landing heavily on the stone floor. After reviewing all evidence, witness testimonies, and submitted documentation, the court hereby declares Defendant Sergeant Blake is permanently stripped of his police badge and is barred from working in any security organization. This sentence is to ensure that such abuse of power will never be repeated by this individual. The room erupted in murmurs, which quickly rose into a storm of applause. Blake's face drained of color, his hands trembling as he heard the words that severed his career for good. Then the judge turned to Hart, his tone lower but just as firm. As for Officer Hart, considering the defendant's cooperation, his provision of crucial information, and demonstrated remorse, the court sentences him to a suspended sentence and mandates a 2-year rehabilitation program. This is the final opportunity for the defendant to correct his path and relearn the true meaning of wearing the uniform. Hart shut his eyes, breathing unevenly, and and when he opened them, they reflected a mix of relief and shame. Applause filled the room again this time, joined by chants of justice from the gallery. Some people wept, others embraced tightly in emotion. Journalists rushed to capture every moment, camera flashes bursting in rhythm. Talia watched it all unfold, a deep sense of solace rising within her because after everything, the truth had not been buried. Blake had been stripped of the power he had once abused, and Hart was given a chance to step out of the darkness and begin again. This verdict wasn't only for two officers, it was a message to the entire system: power without accountability leads to collapse. When the judge struck the gavel one final time, the echo rang out like a closing note to a stormy chapter, opening the path to a new era where justice could reclaim its rightful place. Talia rose, walking out of the courtroom amid waves of applause. Outside, hundreds cheered as news of the verdict spread their chants rolling across the square like a rising tide. She held her head high, knowing this was only one victory in a long journey, but enough to ignite hope that justice could still survive and grow when people demand it together. Outside the courthouse, the square, once quiet, erupted like a breaking wave. The crowd had gathered since its early morning, many holding signs demanding justice, and now they cheered together, their voices echoing through nearby streets. "Justice has been served," someone shouted, and hundreds of others joined in unison, forming a chorus of released outrage. Some cried, others embraced smiles mixing with sobs. Young protesters who had once marched now raised their fists, seeing the verdict as proof their voices had mattered. The air was electric, as if the city itself had been recharged after months of darkness cast by abuse of power. Across the square, reporters jostled for position, microphones pointed in every direction, cameras sweeping to capture every second of this historic moment. Every major state network was broadcasting live, from national news to local channels, all running the headline: Sergeant Blake stripped of badge, Hart given suspended sentence and reform. The text scrolling across home screens had millions cheering in sync with the crowd outside. Social media exploded with clips from inside and outside the courtroom, shared at lightning speed, drawing hundreds of thousands of comments. Major newspapers wasted no time, instantly releasing digital editions with bold headlines. One read, "Historic verdict, justice for victims of abuse," while another struck harder, "The fall of an arrogant officer." Legal experts were invited on air to provide analysis, stressing that this wasn't just a sentence for two individuals, it was a wake-up call for the entire system. Television channels aired footage of Talia exiting the courthouse, the scar on her forehead catching the sunlight, portraying her as a new symbol of community strength. Meanwhile, across the state, civil rights groups held small gatherings to share in the moment. Children, women, and the elderly all recounted how they had followed the case from the beginning, and today, as the verdict rang out, a weight seemed to lift from their hearts. The cheering wasn't just a flash of joy, but a sign that faith was being restored. Those who had lost trust in justice now had a reason to believe again that when truth comes into the light, even a system must be forced to change. Inside the media rooms of major networks, phone lines lit up with viewers calling in, many saying they had never seen a case command such widespread attention. A veteran journalist looked at the nonstop updates flashing across the screen and said, "This wasn't just a trial. This was a turning point." And it was true. Even as the cameras slowly turned off, the headlines kept scrolling, and the cheers outside the courthouse echoed again and again, like a long song not easily silenced. Following the landmark verdict, the police department became the center of both public attention and a sweeping reform initiative. Talia walked into headquarters in her new role, greeted by rows of wary, curious eyes from fellow officers. The large meeting room, once used for rigid briefings, was now rearranged into a makeshift classroom. On the projection screen at the front, Talia prepared training materials on equitable conduct and the responsible use of authority. Officers, from fresh recruits to seasoned veterans, were now required to attend, no longer allowed to hide behind busy schedules or dismiss the sessions as unimportant. Talia's first lesson didn't begin with dry theory, but with the very footage that had shaken the public. Blake delivering the kick, Hart pinning her to the wall, and the words laced with bias. When the images played, the room fell into a heavy silence. Talia stood before the screen, her voice firm. "This is a clear example of power abused. This is not how you protect a community. It's how you destroy trust." Faces remained still, some eyes downcast, others holding their breath. Using her own experience, Talia turned the lesson into a reckoning, forcing everyone to confront the true cost of misconduct. Alongside training, she and her advisory team began a full review of internal protocols. Vague policies that had once allowed officers to act on instinct were eliminated or rewritten entirely. In their place, a structured framework was established, clearly defining procedures for stops, searches, and use of force. Every action must have a basis, and that basis must be transparent to the public, Talia declared during a meeting with department leadership. Her decisive words cut through old habits like a blade, drawing uneasy expressions from senior ranks, but no one dared to object. Talia's boldest move was opening the department to outside oversight. She proposed creating a community review board composed of civilian representatives with authority to review complaints and disciplinary decisions. The idea initially met sharp resistance from some veteran officers worried their power would be diminished. Talia stood firm. "If you have nothing to hide, oversight reinforces trust, not threatens it." The quote spread quickly, appearing in news outlets as a signal that real change was underway. Gradually, the atmosphere inside the police department began to shift. What started as awkward training sessions eventually sparked more questions, more critical discussions, and even apologies from officers who had once held deep-seated biases. Some admitted they had been taught to suspect certain groups by default, and now they understood how that had fueled a cycle of injustice. Talia didn't let those confessions fade. She used them as a foundation for changing perspectives, clearly stating, "We cannot rewrite the past, but we can choose how we act in the present and the future." The early days of reform were filled with resistance, but Talia's persistence slowly made it real. What began with a fiery courtroom trial had now expanded into a broader front, a movement to reform an entire system long accustomed to silence and protectionism. And in every step forward, despite the challenges, Talia knew she was guiding the organization closer to what the community had always demanded: justice that is clean, transparent, and fair. The Independent Community Oversight Board was established during a public meeting where Talia laid out its powers and responsibilities. Its members included not only legal experts and scholars, but also everyday citizens who had been affected by abuse of authority. Their presence was significant. The voice of justice was no longer confined within police walls, but handed back to the people. The board's first sessions were held in the city's cultural center, attended by dozens, with the doors open for anyone who wished to observe. No more silence around accusations. Every case was discussed publicly, documented, and broadcast live for full transparency. Initially, some officers resisted, claiming outside scrutiny infringed on their professional autonomy, but transparency forced a shift. When complaints arose, the board conducted direct reviews, compared them with internal reports, and even met with witnesses. The resulting decisions, made in the open, sent a powerful message. Citizens felt more secure knowing their rights were protected by an independent mechanism, free from the influence of officials who had once been under suspicion. Positive feedback from the community came faster than expected. On social media, many shared that for the first time they truly believed their voices were being heard. A woman who had once hesitated to report police harassment now confidently filed a complaint knowing it wouldn't be ignored. A group of young black men, long distrustful of law enforcement, began attending public meetings, asking questions, offering proposals. That growing participation reshaped the mood of the city, shifting it from doubt to hope. It wasn't just ordinary citizens. Many local businesses also voiced their support. They believed that a safe and fair environment was the foundation for economic growth. Shops that once feared arbitrary and excessive successive inspections now operate with greater peace of mind. Several shop owners sent letters of appreciation to Talia, affirming that the presence of the oversight board made them believe the city was truly changing. Even in schools, this transformation had a positive ripple effect. Teachers used stories about the board to show students that justice wasn't an abstract concept, but something that could be built through concrete actions. Many children expressed a desire to one day participate in oversight work as a way to help protect their own communities. Talia watched all these responses and felt the growing trust. She understood that any reform only held real value when people believed in it and actively took part. Establishing independent community oversight didn't just stop future abuse, it opened a new era, one in which the police and the public were no longer opposing forces, but two parts of a shared system of protection. And when applause echoed through those public meetings, Talia knew her choices had been right, that the fire of justice had found a place to ignite and spread. The city's cultural center lit up early that day, the large auditorium usually reserved for concerts or exhibitions now filled with hundreds of residents. Rows of plastic chairs were packed tight, the aisles were narrow, and many still stood outside waiting to get in. On stage, a banner reading Community Forum, Justice and Fairness hung neatly above a row of microphones already set up. The atmosphere started out a bit hesitant, but when Talia stepped up to introduce the purpose of the gathering, the eyes turned toward her, lit up with expectation. She emphasized that this was a space for everyone to speak their truth without interruption, without being dismissed. The first to stand was a middle-aged man, his voice hoarse but clear. He recounted being pulled over just for driving a new model car and interrogated like a criminal for over an hour on the highway. Murmurs of outrage echoed through the room, heads nodding in recognition of similar experiences. After him, a young woman carrying a small child stepped forward, tears streaming down her face as she told how her husband was beaten right outside their home simply for coming back late after a night shift. Her story silenced the room, leaving only the sound of muffled sobs. The stories kept coming like an unstoppable current. A college student shared how he was repeatedly pulled over on campus just for looking like a troublemaker. An elderly man told how he had been taken to the station years ago for suspicious behavior and still felt anxiety every time he heard a siren. Each account tore through the silence that had blanketed the community for so long. No one felt ashamed to speak anymore because they understood that raising their voice transformed private pain into collective strength. A journalist seated at the back furiously took notes, his hand trembling at the shocking details. He knew these weren't just isolated incidents, but collective evidence of how deep the injustice ran. Online, the forum was being live-streamed with tens of thousands of viewers tuning in and a flood of comments pouring in. That happened to me too. We need to change this. Despite the weight of the pain being brought into the open, the energy in the room shifted, an energy born of solidarity. Talia sat in the front row listening closely, her expression solemn but deeply compassionate. She understood that no verdict, no reform program would have true power without these voices. They were the foundation upon which lasting change must be built. When one citizen finished speaking, the room erupted in applause, not just as comfort, but as recognition that their voice had been heard. And so the clapping continued, joining with the sobs, forming a chorus both painful and proud. That night, the forum didn't end at the scheduled time, but no one wanted to leave. For the first time in many years of silence, people felt they were truly given the chance to tell their own truths. And truth, once spoken together, became a light illuminating the entire room, shining into corners many had thought would never be reached. While the forum was still buzzing, a small hand suddenly rose from the front rows. It was a little girl about 8 years old. her clear eyes wide, her voice hesitant but loud enough in the quiet space. "Miss Talia, what is justice?" The entire hall seemed to hold its breath. Faces, once tight with emotion from painful stories, now softened. Her mother quickly placed a hand on her shoulder as if to stop her, but Talia had already stepped closer, smiling gently at the child. That question, seemingly innocent, was the one every adult longed to answer. Talia knelt to meet the girl's eye level, her gaze kind yet firm, marked by someone who had endured much. She spoke slowly, her voice carrying through the room. "Justice is when everyone is treated with equal respect, when no one is judged for their skin color, gender, or where they were born. Justice is when you walk outside and are seen as just a normal person, not someone to be suspected." Those simple words flowed like cool water through an atmosphere that had been tense for too long, reminding everyone that the heart of every struggle lies not in verdicts or reports, but in the dignity of human beings. The little girl tilted her head, her eyes lighting up, then nodded slightly as if she understood. The moment moved the entire hall. Many people began to cry. A man in the back whispered, "Simple, but the truest answer." The brief silence that followed Talia's words broke into a wave of applause, not the polite kind, but clapping from the heart. The sound swelled, spreading from the front rows to the back, becoming a powerful rhythm. The applause continued, mixed with chants of justice, a collective affirmation. People realized they hadn't come just to share their pain, but to define together the true meaning of what they were seeking. The live broadcast captured Talia standing at the center of the room, bowing in gratitude, surrounded by a forest of clapping hands, a scene that sent chills even through the screens of those watching from home. That shared moment became a milestone, proof that faith had returned. Talia's brief answer was not just for a child, but for the whole community, for anyone searching for direction after years of darkness. And as the applause echoed on, everyone understood that from this point forward, they now shared a clear definition, a common ideal to protect and carry forward. In the quiet office, morning light poured through the large window, casting a soft glow across the wooden desk where Talia sat. On the desk stood a small tilted photo frame capturing a moment that once shook the entire city, an image of her being kicked in the stomach by Blake, her face contorted in pain, blood streaming down from her forehead. It was a photo once featured on the front page of a newspaper, and she kept it not to torment herself, but to remind her that from the lowest place a person can still rise and go far. Each time she looked at it, the pain no longer lingered. Only a firm resolve remained that justice never comes from silence. Her phone buzzed on the desk, displaying a breaking news alert. A short headline appeared: "Former Officer Blake, now working as a security guard at a local supermarket." Talia tilted her head, slightly, eyes resting on the words for a long moment. There was no sense of triumph, no satisfaction, only a quiet, indescribable stillness. The man who once stood arrogantly above others now wore a guard's uniform, standing under fluorescent lights, checking receipts and shopping carts. It wasn't a legal sentence, it was the natural consequence of his choices. Talia exhaled deeply, a stream of memories surfacing from her confrontations with him. But she shook her head gently, brushing the image aside to refocus on the path ahead. At the corner of her desk, a tall stack of folders awaited, most related to community oversight programs and ongoing reform projects. The past year had been anything but easy, yet the results made every drop of effort worthwhile. Reports showed a sharp decline in complaints about abuse of power, and public trust in law enforcement was gradually being restored. Though many issues remained, the shift was proof that a single kick that once drew blood had also sparked a fire for change in the heart of a community. Talia leaned back in her chair, letting her gaze drift once more to the photo on her desk. It remained an unchanging reminder, while outside, Blake had fallen from power, now a shadow adrift in the flow of everyday life. She no longer felt the need to dwell on him because to her, the greatest victory wasn't in seeing an adversary fall, but knowing that justice had been affirmed and from it an entire system transformed. In that quiet space, Talia knew her journey was far from over, but her steps were steadier than ever. A white envelope sat neatly on the desk, Talia's name written in slightly shaky handwriting, likely Hart's. She opened it, unfolding the paper inside, and the first line made her pause. "Thank you for giving me a chance to make things right." Hart wrote that after the trial ended, he began attending the Reformation Program sessions on human rights and social justice. He described walking into the classroom for the first time, the shame of facing the eyes of those who had once been victims, and how it was through that discomfort he finally began to understand the pain he had helped cause. Hart admitted that he had once allowed himself to be swept up by peer pressure and outdated practices in the force, losing the ability to see the truth. In the letter, he said that without Talia's firmness and resolve, he would likely still be a blind cog in a broken machine. In the closing paragraph, Hart expressed that he didn't expect instant forgiveness, but hoped that one day he could prove through action that he had truly changed. He shared how he had started volunteering in community programs, teaching kids self-defense and supporting people who once feared any contact with police. "I want those who see me now to no longer see an abusive officer, but a man learning to stand upright again," Hart wrote. That line stirred something quiet in Talia, not just because it reflected personal remorse, but because it carried the hope that even those who had once strayed could find their way back into the light. Talia folded the letter carefully, her hands holding it a moment longer before setting it down. She glanced at the framed photo on her desk, then back at the white envelope, two small objects holding two extremes, one a painful memory, the other a sign of redemption. Slowly, she opened a drawer, placed the letter inside, right beside the reform files she had been working on. As the drawer clicked shut, she drew a deep breath as if sealing away both the weight and the hope for what was to come. In that moment, Talia didn't dwell on Hart as an individual, but on something greater, that the pursuit of justice doesn't end with a verdict, but continues in the choices made by those who remain. That letter stored in the drawer stood as proof that sometimes justice doesn't just punish, it also opens a door for people to make amends and begin again. In the police department's rookie training class, white light from the projection screen washed over the serious faces of young recruits, some eyes still eager, others tense. On the screen, the now familiar clip played again, the brutal kick to Talia, blood streaming from her forehead, the mocking laughter, the baseless accusations. The room remained silent. No scraping chairs, no whispers. That moment was not shown to provoke shame, but to serve as a moral lesson etched into the minds of those about to wear the uniform. The instructor, a seasoned officer, stood beside the screen, his voice steady and low. "You need to understand the power in your hands can protect, but it can also destroy. What we just watched is the clearest example of destruction." After the clip ended, the heavy silence lingered for a few seconds before the first hand went up. A young recruit asked, voice slightly shaky but firm, "If I were there, how would I know the difference between reasonable suspicion and bias?" The question struck at the heart of the issue, prompting others to jump into the discussion. One side insisted that power enables officers to act quickly to keep communities safe, while the other countered that power cannot override basic human dignity. Voices overlapped, faces flushed with disagreement, but no one wanted to stop. They all felt that this wasn't just a video, it was a mirror, reflecting the future of their profession. The instructor let the debate unfold, his eyes scanning the room as if to see who truly grasped the core of the issue. When the energy peaked, he finally spoke firmly. "The power you are given is not for feeding your ego, but for upholding justice. Responsibility doesn't come as a choice, it's a duty." He recounted other cases from the past. past, some where police bravery saved lives but also tragedies where abused power led to irreparable harm. Each example was a slice of reality prompting both admiration and unease in the young recruits. The debate didn't end there. One recruit argued that without toughness, officers would lose authority, but was quickly countered by the view that true authority comes from transparency and fairness. Eyes lit up as they realized the complexity of the job, that there were no easy lines, but precisely because of that, they had to learn how to stay grounded. The session came to a close as the instructor emphasized, "Today's lesson isn't about the clip, it's about the decision each of you will face to become an abuser of power or a protector of the people." The class remained silent, eyes fixed on the now dark screen, though its echoes still rang in everyone's minds. They knew they had just gone through a session unlike any other, a lesson that planted the weight of responsibility alongside a sense of pride that wearing the uniform meant carrying the trust of an entire community on their shoulders. The instructor stood tall, his stern gaze sweeping the room before he spoke slowly but firmly. "No one is above the law, not even the police." The sentence echoed through the room, not loud but heavy enough to silence every argument that had come before. The young faces, once fervent with debate, froze, their expressions shifting between confusion and reflection. What they had just heard wasn't an empty slogan, but a direct reminder of the role they were about to take on. That uniform might grant power, but it also demands accountability to the people and to the law. In that moment, the classroom fell into complete stillness, broken only by the steady hum of the ceiling fan above. No one spoke. Every head bowed slightly, as if each person were examining themselves through the images they had just seen. They no longer saw the clip as a distant tragedy, but as a real possibility, something that could happen if they ever lost sight of the line. The instructor's words felt like a final punctuation mark, affirming that police are not the ultimate judges, but citizens bound by law like anyone else. The silence lingered not from discomfort, but as a necessary pause. It gave weight to every word that had been said, forcing each recruit to internalize the message. A few eyes showed deep thought, some hands clenched on thighs, signals of the storm of reflection inside. No one laughed, no one sighed. Everyone focused entirely on absorbing the final lesson of the session. The instructor observed, satisfied with the atmosphere, knowing that silence was the clearest sign of seriousness. Out in the hallway, sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long streaks across the floor, a stark contrast to the thick atmosphere inside. When the bell finally rang to end the session, no one jumped up as usual. The recruits sat still for a moment longer, as if trying to hold on to the weight of what they'd just heard. It was no longer just a lecture, it was a reminder that might follow them for the rest of their careers. And as each of them stood moving more slowly, eyes lowered. Talia, the one whose story shaped the lesson, seemed to linger somewhere in that room, a quiet symbol of the justice they were now learning to uphold. On a weekend afternoon, soft sunlight spilled across the street in front of the police department. The peaceful air, a stark contrast to the stormy days that once loomed over this place. Talia had just stepped out of the building, the voices of colleagues still echoing behind her as they discussed the next phase of reform. Amid the flow of people coming and going, she spotted a familiar figure, a mother and the young girl who had once witnessed Blake's brutal assault. The girl had grown her face now bright and free of fear, her eyes filled with curiosity and admiration as she looked at Talia. The mother walked slowly, gently squeezing her daughter's shoulder as if to encourage her, then stopped in front of Talia. For a moment, the three of them stood there surrounded by a crowd, yet somehow set apart. The mother raised her head, her voice slightly trembling but clear. "Thank you for standing tall." Just one short sentence, but it held the weight of those who had once seen injustice and now found reason to believe. Talia gave a gentle nod, a faint smile touching her lips, her eyes warm. She knew that the thanks wasn't meant just for her, but for the painful yet resilient journey this community had walked together. The girl leaned into her mother, then looked up at Talia with wide, eager eyes, her lips parted as if to ask something, but she said nothing. That moment brought Talia back to the night of the town hall, when another child had asked her what justice meant. Those innocent but piercing questions were a measure of the future, a reminder of why she kept going despite the road ahead. Talia bent slightly, resting a hand gently on the girl's shoulder, as if to pass along a promise that the next generation wouldn't have to carry the wounds of the last. The mother tightened her grip on her daughter's hand, and the two turned to leave their figures gradually fading into the dispersing crowd under the late afternoon sun. Talia stood still for a few seconds, breathing in the quiet air, a lightness rising in her chest. She knew that justice would never be final. It must always be guarded, nurtured, and fought for. But in this moment, with a simple thank you and a child's bright gaze, she allowed herself to believe that the journey had planted firm seeds. And as the last light of day cast a long shadow across the department steps, Talia smiled and walked forward, carrying the belief that change would keep spreading. Talia stood at the entrance of the police department, the evening sun resting on her shoulders like a soft cloak. When she heard that thank you, she simply smiled, a smile not dazzling but quiet, filled with the weight of the road she had traveled. She nodded gently, a gesture simple yet full of meaning, a response in place of all the words too complex to say. In that moment, Talia no longer felt like a lone individual who had once been attacked and humiliated in the street, but like a symbol of rising again, of the strength of a community. That smile was not just for the mother and child, but for the entire city watching. The mother and daughter walked away hand in hand, slow but steady, blending into the flow of weekend foot traffic. Their figures faded into the evening light, disappearing behind the corner, where tree shadows stretched long across the street. The scene left a lingering stillness, like the final gentle note after a stormy piece of music. This very place, once the center of outrage and filled with cries for justice, now rested in silence and calm, as if the city had found a new rhythm in its breath. Talia remained standing, watching until they were completely out of sight, her chest filled with a feeling she couldn't quite name. It wasn't personal pride, but a quiet peace in knowing her pain had grown into a seed of hope. She let the soft breeze carry away the remnants of her worry, leaving a rare, tranquil space in her mind. All the turmoil, the trials, the arguments, the memories lined with blood and tears had receded into the background, making way for stillness. The sky turned amber as the crowds thinned and the city eased into its usual rhythm. Talia turned and began to walk, but the memory of that brief encounter still lingered in her heart like a small flame. It no longer burned wildly like in the early days, but steadily, persistently, reminding her that the journey for justice was never truly over. And as the doors of the police department closed behind her, the sounds of people's laughter echoed somewhere nearby. Talia knew then, even though those figures had vanished, the quiet aftermath remained like a silent promise that the city had been changed forever. The story came to a close as the mother and daughter disappeared down the quiet evening street, leaving Talia still at the department gates wearing a calm smile. From that very first moment, Blake kicked her to the ground, to the lonely days recovering in a small apartment, to the decision to release the clip that would change the city. The path had been marked by blood, tears, and bravery. It not only exposed the truth of violence and prejudice, but also opened a new era where justice could be seen and truly felt. Talia's image was no longer that of a woman who had endured injustice, but of a symbol of resilience for a community that had reclaimed its voice. Looking back, a year later, the outcome of each person's journey spoke for itself. Blake, once arrogant in his belief that power was a shield, now stood quietly in a supermarket security uniform. Hart, once caught in a blind system, had found a chance to make amends and start anew. The community, having weathered the storms, had matured. Pain had been turned into action and anger into a force for reform. From that revealed truth, the city had gained an independent oversight committee, new training programs for recruits, and public forums where people could speak freely. None of it remained just promises on paper. It had become a living, breathing reality. Talia knew the journey wasn't over, but she also understood the value of every step taken. The greatest lesson didn't lie in verdicts or chants outside the courthouse, but in the transformation within each person. A once silent community had found the courage to share its stories. A once cowardly officer was learning to face the truth. A child who once asked about justice could now smile, having seen adults stand up for what's right. All of these moments came together as proof that justice isn't some distant concept, but something that lives in every choice, every small yet decisive action. This story carries a clear message. Power is not a shield to suppress, but a responsibility to protect. The greater the power, the closer one must stand to the people, the more integrity one must uphold in wearing the uniform. Because when power is abused, it turns back on its wielder, destroying both the abuser and the community's trust. And when justice is restored, it doesn't just repair a single incident, it plants the seeds for the next generation to grow up living with honesty and fairness. In the final moment, as Talia walked away from the gates of the police department, the audience could see that this journey wasn't just about the downfall of those who abused authority, but a reminder of the power of courage. Had Talia chosen silence, everything might have been forgotten. But because she stood tall, the blood on her forehead didn't make her bow. It became the mark of a turning point that led a city toward justice. That's why this story isn't just about a case of police brutality, but a declaration of faith in the idea that change always begins with one person brave enough to speak out. And as the calm aftermath lingered on the street, the reader, the viewer, carried with them a simple yet powerful lesson: believe that even in the thickest darkness, light can still be lit from courage. Justice doesn't arrive instantly, but it will come so long as there are people strong enough to stand tall and keep walking.